Let's talk about the Nazca mummies. So many of you have asked me for my thoughts about the discovery of the Nazca mummies in Peru, who many allege are physical proof of the existence of non-human intelligence on planet Earth. Now, I just got off a group call with one of the lead professors studying the Nazca mummies currently in Peru, and I took down some notes that I want to share with you about not only what was stated about the current research, but my thoughts about them. So let's dig in. So we were just able to speak to and ask questions of Dr. Edgar Martin Hernandez, who is a doctor of public health at the National University of San Luis Gonzaga in Ica, Peru. Now, they have 4 of the Nazca mummies in their possession that they are currently researching. There were multiple mummies found that have been spread around a variety of universities, both in Peru and in Mexico. There is a lot of controversy about these bodies being researched because of how they were acquired in Peru. Again, there's some cultural issues related to some of the grave sites and other national monuments in Peru. We're going to leave that off to the side for a second. I took some notes down about what the current status is of the research that's happening specifically at the university in Peru, again, who have 4 bodies. So let's take a look at some of these notes. One of the first questions were around some of the tests that are happening. And again, we just got off this call, so I'm just going to go through my notes top to bottom. So the first note, one of the people asked, have there been any DNA tests done on any of the 4 bodies? So far, no DNA tests have been performed on any of the bodies. The primary reason behind that are budget issues. Then we sort of talked about the chain of custody related to how the university were able to get the bodies in their possession. Do they have a documented trail of where the bodies were before they came into their possession? So they mentioned that before they came to the university, there was DNA tests performed, but there was no scientific organization involved in that DNA testing, and therefore they can't opine on any of the past DNA testing. They did mention that it requires close handling in order to be able to do so. They do not have a documented chain of custody about where the bodies were prior to their arrival at the university. They do have an oral chain of custody, but one that's not documented. When you talk about archaeological finds, that's obviously a huge issue, so there's some tension related to that. They do believe that they need to do complete genome sequencing as well as comparative analysis for similarities and differences not only between human bodies but also other species. The only tests that they've performed so far are X-rays and CT scans. So again, we have 4 bodies, oral chain of custody only, no DNA tests due to budget issues, but X-rays and CT scans. Now, they have published a single paper related to those X-rays and CT scans in a journal that is not specifically related to primarily scientific study. So some people are pointing to an issue in the quality of the original journal that this first paper has been published in. But the studies have been officially approved by the university, so they do have the university backing in terms of them conducting these studies. Again, related to the chain of custody, they do not know how many people had access to, had the ability to manipulate the bodies prior to them getting access to them, but they do know who the original person was that discovered those bodies in an archaeological find. That person was doing so for their own personal reasons. It should be noted that there is currently a $300 million lawsuit in Peru about the way in which this researcher accessed and removed the bodies from their original location and have now allowed some of them to exit the national borders of Peru. We'll come back to that in a second because that's an important point. But that person has already gone to court and is currently in jail serving a sentence related to what is being categorized as grave robbing from some of these national sites in Peru in order to actually provide these mummies to the universities. Now, related to the 4 bodies themselves, one of those bodies, Maria, is close to the size of a normal adult human being. That is the primary body that they've done the X-rays and CT scans on so far. Two of the bodies are approximately 60 centimeters in height with a humanoid body style. The fourth body is the size of a baby human, and based on some of the anatomical studies on that fourth body, it's been determined that the baby, the fourth body, is most likely human because of some of those anatomical characteristics. But the other three have the presence of a sufficient number of extremely rare anatomical aspects that they view to be anomalous as compared to that fourth baby-sized Nazca mummy in their possession. Now, all four of the bodies were discovered to be covered in this white powder material that aided in the preservation of the underlying bodies themselves. There is a name for this material that I cannot pronounce. Someone will certainly add it into the comments. They were able to do a multi-elemental spectral analysis on that white powder material that surrounded the bodies. That material is important because it had properties that allowed much of the structure of those bodies to be maintained over long periods of time. But they have been able to test that material, and some people have suggested that it was used for the embalming of these mummies as if this was, for example, a normal human burial. But what has been identified once that spectral analysis has been done is that that material was not known to have been available or manufactured / engineered by human populations until the 1800s. So this would have been a much earlier time period in which this type of material would have been used in any kind of production context, at least as it pertains to the perception of the scientists in the project. Now, on the primary specimen that they've identified as having some of the most anomalous anatomical structure, that is Maria, the human-sized body of the four, they've done, based on some of those scans that we talked about earlier, there are several facial protrusions that are particularly rare individually in human bodies. And then the fact that there's multiple collectively in this individual body, they are using as a reference point of the probability of it being human, given the existing record, is highly unlikely, but that's not particularly decisive in terms of identifying that it is purely non-human. Those atypical features were all along the mouth region, the chin region, as well as the orbital lobes, which again is interesting. They also identified that it had a 30% higher cranial volume, right? So it had more cranial volume, room for a brain to exist in the head, as well as 30% more encephalic mass. And the way it was described, again, the experts can comment in the comments, as you increase the amount of encephalic mass, as they've studied other animals like birds, the increase in encephalic mass correlates to an increase in intelligence. So the thought here is both because of the 30% larger cranial volume and the 30% greater encephalic mass, whatever this creature is potentially not only as intelligent as human beings, but potentially even more intelligent given that volume difference. And again, that is extrapolating from the difference in encephalic mass size in other intelligent animals, such as birds. Now, one of the things that Professor Hernandez also mentioned is that there are multiple of these bodies, dozens, if not more, that are both in the public eye or the public media sphere and or being studied by multiple university teams. He did make the statement that for many of these tridactyls, so again, all of these mummies only have 3 fingers, which again is a weird anatomical thing, but not completely unheard of as it pertains to normal Homo sapiens sapien or prior progenitor versions of humans. But he did say that for many of these that are also in the media space, they both have not been studied to a level of scientific rigor that can make any claims about them, but also that there are some that have been proven to be fakes that are trying to mimic the ones that they do have that have these aspects that you can point to that are real. So he did try to address the fact that the information space is complex because there are some that are truly organic and authentic, while there are some that have already been proven to be fake or false. Another aspect that many who have been following the Nazca mummy story might be aware of is the presence of metal implants in many of these bodies. Now, for the 4 bodies at the university in Ica, Peru, only the largest body did not have implants, but 2 of the humanoid 60 centimeter size bodies do have those metal implants, but they have not done any studies on the composition of those metal implants in those more humanoid bodies. Some of the other bodies that have been discovered that do have the metal implants have done some early preliminary testing on the composition of those implants, and it's been identified that the presence of osmium in those metal implants is apparently curious, although Professor Hernandez could not speak to that as they've not done those material analysis studies on the bodies in their possession. It should be noted, because it was mentioned, that based on the properties that have been identified as being present in these metal implants and some of the other bodies, the composition presents excellent electrical conduit properties. So it would be similar to the type of metals you would find in technology or other communications type of equipment, which would be curious to be found in an implant that is of this age. Again, that was him opining a little bit on some of these external studies, not suggesting that the bodies they have that composition. And one of the main takeaway points from this was it is a relatively small university that's not super well capitalized or has a ton of money for the type of equipment they would like to have to perform such a comprehensive study. So it is clear that they don't have all the equipment necessary. He identified the number one resource that they need or are looking for collaboration on is the DNA analysis. And he did mention that any research teams or universities that would like to come down to Peru to access the bodies or would like to do their own studies locally here in the United States, they are open to those conversations, as they believe that they need to expand the number of research teams that are looking at these bodies. So for anyone here who's following, who either is a researcher themselves, has family or friends that's in this space, please add a comment below or send me a direct message, and I'll make the connection, as they are looking to bring in more academic institutions into the study of the bodies, and they're very willing to both either provide access locally or talk about providing necessary samples internationally as well. So with all of that said, what is my opinion about the current state of research related to the Nazca mummies? My view is that it's very preliminary. While there's some indicators that are curious and interesting about the anatomical anomalies related to several of these bodies, it's still not yet conclusive, especially given we don't have a clear chain of custody and we haven't even gotten to the point where there's been DNA analysis done. Now, there's going to be some challenge with the DNA analysis given how old these samples are, but it is a key component to the total picture. So I do think that it is intriguing and interesting given the aggregation of anomalies that make it, from a probabilistic perspective, curious if they did in fact end up being human or one of the related early versions of humans before we got to Homo sapiens sapiens. But again, I think it is still too premature to jump to a conclusion that these are clearly non-human on its face. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, which also is going to require a significant amount of capital or money to conduct some of these tests, which are extremely expensive. But it is encouraging to see that the scientific community is taking it seriously with a level of scientific rigor I think that's necessary to try to ascertain whether or not we are looking at physical evidence of non-human remains. But at this point in time, anyone who's out in the public saying definitively that these clearly represent non-human beings, I think is a little premature. We are not there yet, and it would not, based on the single peer-reviewed published paper that exists right now and the type of research that's been conducted up until this point, it is not at the sufficient level of scientific rigor for mainstream journals and the larger scientific community to accept those findings. So the jury is still out, and we shall see, but at least at a high level, we are looking at some of these bodies not being purely paper mache or any number of put together different pieces. Now, as Dr. Hernandez mentioned, some people have put out bodies that seem to fit that profile, but as it pertains to their study, the four in their possession do not fit that profile. So, inconclusive, interesting nonetheless, and we shall see what further research brings forth in terms of any further, more conclusive determinations about the nature and origins of the Nazca mummies.